So thank you. My name is Mark Pearson. I'm the Senior Analyst in the Research Intelligence team, and I look after the industry analysis and data collection for the radio and audio sector. Those of you who are broadcasters may also know me by one of the other addresses I use, so I'm responsible for all those radio mid emails that you may receive each year for the data collection. So, first things first, for those of you who don't know, Ofcom is the UK's communications regulator, and I think we have a simple mission, which is to make communications work for everyone. Although the mission sounds quite simple, actually the execution is challenging and requires us to sort of take a multifaceted approach. We look after all communication sectors from broadcasting, so TV and radio, of course, through telecoms, through post, and of course, most recently, we've taken on responsibility for the online safety regime. We have 4 broad areas of work which permeate throughout the organisation, which help us to sort of guide and focus our efforts over the planning cycle. So the first is to ensure that we have internet that everyone can rely on, so robust internet access, good connectivity. Secondly is to ensure that we have a media ecosystem which we can all trust and value. The third is for us to work to create a safer life online for all people, but especially for children. And then fourthly, ensure we use a spectrum as efficiently as possible to enable wireless services in the wider economy. So our remit is broad, and audiences are very much at the heart of it. So media is a big part of what we do at Ofcom, and in some ways it's the most famous thing that we're known for, given the fines and the findings that are reported in the news. But actually, we do a whole load of other work in the sector, and thinking about our media work again, our main priorities are ensuring that there's UK content which is produced across the UK and reflects its diversity. Secondly, ensuring a plurality of content providers and content producers that compete fairly. Thirdly, the protection of audiences from harmful content, whilst also ensuring we preserve freedom of expression. And then fourth, ensuring we have broadcast news that is accurate, impartial and trusted. And evidence is at the foundation of how we approach all our policy decisions. And this is where the research and intelligence team comes in and plays such a critical role. We provide the insight and evidence which guides our policy making, but we also provide data on the UK media market to external stakeholders to help everyone to understand the UK media landscape in an objective and data-first way. So then, taking a step back and looking at radio and audio activities overall, despite the plethora of audio options that people have today, listening to the radio, in particular music-based radio, continues to be the most common audio activity people do at least weekly, with 61% of adults saying that they did this in our 2020 audio survey, a decline, admittedly, from 66% in 2023. There are, however, some differences, as one would expect, by age. So those aged 35 to 54 and those aged 55 and above were more likely to listen to the radio than those aged 16 to 34, of whom only half said that they did this weekly in 2024. We can also see that just around half of people report listening to an online music streaming service, and that figure has remained relatively constant over the past couple of years. But again, we see behaviours varying significantly with age, with 79% of those in the 15 to 34 category listening to an online music streaming service weekly, compared to only 26% of those aged 55 and over. And 30% of people in the survey told us they listen to podcasts on at least a weekly basis. Again, those aged 15 to 34 were more likely to do this compared to the population as a whole, and also compared to the older demographic groups as well. Our survey data shows us, we see a picture of complementarity rather than substitution, as people use audio services for a range of reasons. So looking here primarily at speech-based services, I think we can see the distinctive roles played by the different audio formats. For example, the immediacy of news on radio, podcasts as a medium for learning about new things and entertainment, and audiobooks as a source of relaxation. And of course, we also see people using other types of audio content, such as audio meditations, as an aid to make them feel better and to relax. So turning to radio, and broadcast radio in particular, we see that commercial broadcast radio revenues have continued to be resilient despite the changes in the advertising market and in particular the growth of online. Radio continues to have a higher reach. Audiences and advertisers trust and value broadcast radio, and it's also seen as, I think, quite a good value for money for a brand medium. Radio relevant turnover, i.e. revenues associated with the holding of an Ofcom commercial radio licence, were a record 656 million in 2022, up 3% year on year. The key trend I think we've seen over time has been the growth in national commercial spot advertising, despite the dip last year, which was caused by the unwinding of some pandemic-related advertising expenditure, and of course the growth we've seen over time in commercial sponsorship revenues. And to put this into context, commercial radio revenues form a sizable component of what one might think of the commercial audio market as a whole. So consumer expenditure on music streaming subscriptions in 2022 was around 1.6 billion, while total online digital audio advertising expenditure, which includes music streaming, online radio and podcasts, was 186 million. So as you can see here, radio continues to be a quite substantial part of the overall audio market. And this resilience of radio advertising revenues, I think, reflects, the shift we've seen towards national commercial services. So between 2014 and 2023, we saw commercial radio listening hours among adults, so those aged 15 and above, grow by 27% in absolute terms. A key driver of this has been the growth of listening to national commercial stations, which grew from 12.3% at the start of 2014 to reach 26.8% by the end of 2023. And this reflects, of course, both the growth of brand extension stations, for example, the Decade stations, but also we've seen the launch of new national services on DAB. So the BBC is the most commonly used provider for online radio, while Spotify is most commonly used for music streaming. And I think the results of our survey here show that, despite the fact there are multiple types of audio content available on different platforms, our platforms may be viewed and used differently by different people for different types of audio content. So, we see also some differences by age, interestingly. So, for example, in 2024, over 55s who listen to online radio and podcasts were more likely to use BBC Sounds for those activities than younger listeners, whilst under 35s were more likely to use global stations or YouTube for online radio and for Spotify to listen to audiobooks and podcasts compared to the average adult. Now, note our survey here includes Spotify and Amazon Music as options under the radio online. That's because in the past, many respondents actually wrote in these services as an other option in the survey. And that's due to, I think, the sort of radio station's functionality. But I think that's quite interesting finding in itself because, again, it indicates how certain people are thinking about their definition of radio. So looking at in-car audio now, majority of car drivers and passengers listen to radio in the car, and quite clearly there's a lot of discussion in the industry at the moment going on about in-car audio activities, which I think reflects interaction between two sets of trends. We've got the broader audio market trends, the growth of listening to IP-enabled audio, but also the adoption of new technologies in cars, the shift towards electrification, built-in connectivity, large screens, and the car manufacturers themselves seeking to offer services directly to drivers. So in summary, this is all sometimes described as sort of cars as becoming smartphones on wheels. So the activities people are actually doing in the car, again, we see here, listening to AM, FM on DAB radio was the most common in-car activity in 2023, with over half of drivers doing at least one of these. However, we have seen 1 in 5 drivers and passengers using a streaming service on their mobile phone for in-car streaming, and that was up from 17% in 2022. And again, common theme here, we see though younger demographic groups more likely than adults as a whole to use streaming services in the car. DAB continues to increase its share of in-car listening. So what we have seen, again, over time is a shift in car listening away from AM, FM towards DAB. We've also seen a slight increase in internet share of in-car listening, which has grown from 4.6% to 7.2%. But radio listening on via the internet in cars remains comparatively rare compared to that in the home, where a lot of that's been, of course, enabled by smart speakers. We're also seeing, of course, developments such as hybrid radios in cars, which combine both broadcast and IP streams to offer a best quality radio experience at any given time, which I think in future might blur this distinction between broadcast and IP radio listening in the car. So we look at functionalities available in cars today, on the road today. So our latest available technology tracker data from 2023 has 62% of people who have a car or use a car report having a DAB radio, which is a figure which is comparable with the 2022 figure. But what we have seen is a growth in the number of people with a touchscreen infotainment system in the car, or the ability to stream audio from a phone via the car's dashboard. So although some of these connected car technologies are quite new, they were starting to see some of these technologies percolate through as people replace their cars, and even more advanced technologies such as things like Android Automotive come onto the market. Turning to podcasts then. The key question, I think, for all podcasters is their distribution strategy, i.e. the what and the where. So our research shows that people access podcasts through a range of services, and in terms of overall use, the 3 largest services, so Sounds, Spotify, YouTube, are roughly evenly matched in terms of reach. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people use these services in the same way. When we ask podcast listeners what service they use most, I think we see a quite different pattern emerge. For example, when we look at commercial radio, 23% of regular podcast listeners use a commercial radio website or app at some point for podcasts, but only 6% use it as their most frequent thing, which again suggests that people are going to some of these services to meet a particular need, possibly, for example, for an exclusive or a windowed podcast. So what we see is entertainment, news and talk shows, comedy continue to be the most popular podcast genres. And we've continue to see some high-profile launches. So, for example, in the news space, we've seen Telegraph, for example, launching its daily news podcast, which is scheduled for next month. And actually, it's quite interesting, I think, that in 2024, 30% of regular podcast listeners listen to a podcast produced by a newspaper or magazine, at least weekly. So the audio space is not just traditional broadcast. It's not just celebrities and audio production. We're also seeing newspapers and other news brands getting involved here as well. And then finally, topic of monetisation, concerns about ad loads and discoverability are being consistent themes, I think, at a lot of audio conferences. And we have tracked attitudes and opinions about podcasts among regular podcast listeners now for some years. And for example, when we look at advertising, we see that advertising funds many podcasts. We've seen changes to podcast advertising, increasing dynamic ad insertion, use of programmatic to more traditional host-read, and the concerns around ad loads, and which we've seen. But actually, I think when we actually look at the data, a slightly different story emerges. And so around 4 in 10 say that there are too many adverts on the podcasts I listen to. But that figure's been consistent now for a few years. So with that, I will just let you know that we have various publications. So we've published our audio listing in the UK report on the 16th of April, and a lot of the data in this presentation comes from that. And there's also data tables on our website. In the summer, we'll be publishing the Communications Market Report, which is our interactive data portal with updated data on our radio and audio consumption and revenues. And then finally, also in the summer, we'll be publishing our Media Nations report. This is our annual flagship narrative report in which we do deep dives into some of the data and also some of the key market developments in the sector. So thank you.